Okay, so there's a lot of focus today on the Kingston Park and North Richmond by-election. Um, I think I've got the name Laxey right. It's one of those places that's a little bit of a mouthful. I think I've got that right. Um, it's making a lot of news because the Liberal Democrats have gained a surprise upset, or it's been described as a surprise upset. Sarah Olney has defeated incumbent Zac Goldsmith. Zac Goldsmith was standing as an independent now. He has, of course, become prominent because he stood for Mayor of London earlier this year on the Conservative ticket, and that was a much derided campaign. It was seen as populist and somewhat opportunistic in terms of how he portrayed his opponent. That's one of the allegations anyway. Whether it's fair or not, so obviously the Goldsmith team would dispute that. Um, this has been a tough year for Zac Goldsmith. To lose the London mayoralty, then a by-election in the same year is a double blow. So it's been a tough year for him. Um, as for Sarah Olney, I really can't say much because I don't know much about her. Apparently, she hasn't even been involved in politics until last year. So, as far as I know, she hasn't even been a councillor. In terms of this being an upset, it depends what way you look at it. Apparently, this area had been heavily pro-Remain anyway, so I don't think it can really be seen as an anti-Brexit vote as such, given that it's a pro-Europe area anyway, as is much of London. Um, Goldsmith had taken a bit of a risk, obviously, by standing as an independent, because from what I understand, he had stood in his position and protested the government's position, green light for a third Heathrow runway, something he was against. What I'm going to say about this is just a few thoughts on the way forward for the centre and the situation of the Liberal Democrats. There's no mystery that the Liberal Democrats took a massive blow after the last election. You know, to go from 57 MPs down to 8 was a complete disaster. And I have no doubt a large part of that was sort of voter punishment, so to speak, for being in coalition. I have to say, I find it somewhat sad that the British still haven't adapted to the idea of parties working together. That's my own view on that. I think that Dems are somewhat disproportionately punished, so to speak, for being in coalition government. Because it was either a case of languishing in opposition or taking the controversial decision and being part of a larger administration. Now, the problem is a minority party always suffers, and I guess the Lib Dems found out the hard way. Nevertheless, Nick Clegg was arguably the most successful Liberal since David Lloyd George. Charles Kennedy electorally probably more successful, but Nick Clegg is going to go down, I believe, as a significant figure in modern British history because of that. I don't know enough about this particular seat to know the issues that were involved, but on her victory, Sarah Olney said that this was a victory for compassion, tolerance, and open society. So very trademark Liberal sort of positions. And she took a little swipe at UKIP. What I would say is, I have to say I'm not a massive fan of Tim Farron's Lib Dems, and the reason is because I believe they are out of touch with some very important issues. I do not expect the Liberal Democrats or other centrist parties to basically toe the UKIP line of populist nationalism, and that's what I believe UKIP does. But at the same time, they need to get in touch with things that drive people to UKIP in the first place. So fear of immigration levels, Islamist terrorism. These are issues that the Lib Dems still will not talk about. And yes, they have to accept the result of the EU referendum. Now, Sarah Olney says she doesn't want a hard Brexit. I understand where she's coming from with that. But she said we want to stay in the single market. That indicates to me that she is going to toe the same line as her leader and reject the result of a democratic referendum. John Major said, we have never been a tyranny of the majority. And again, I understand what he means. But I think those anti-Brexit MPs need to stop basically given this impression that they think those who voted Leave are all idiots, misled by Nigel Farage. I'm sure not everyone who voted Leave are hardcore UKIP supporters. I'm sure there were people on the fence who voted to Leave. What I would say, though, is months on from the referendum, unfortunately, there is still a lot of mudslinging both ways. Firstly, those of us who voted Remain need to stop dismissing those who voted Leave as small-minded nationalists. That is not the case. They voted Leave because they were genuinely fed up with the European Union, and they had genuine concerns about the European Union. And I relate to that because I also have concerns about the European Union. But what I would say is I am also getting a little bit fed up with some people on the Leave side dismissing 16 million people as liberal elites. Now, I don't live in an ivory tower. I don't live in some leafy London suburb. I live in the northeast of England. I'm hardly from a very prosperous background. So in no way am I a liberal elite. And I am also concerned about immigration. I'm also concerned about Islamist terrorism. So let's just stop dismissing people as either Little Englander racists or liberal elite. It's not that simple. It really is not that simple. And it works both ways. So what I would say to pro-Brexit people is, yes, the other side has to respect that democratic mandate. But by the same token, you have to listen to the concerns that people have about a hard Brexit. This is a major decision. And it is fair that people ask questions in a democracy. Just because your side wins doesn't mean the other side isn't allowed to ask questions. You know, that's not challenging a result. That's simply wanting to ensure that it's best for everyone. A Major is right about that. We've never been about tyranny of the majority. In other words, just because one side wins doesn't mean they get to dictate everything. Their will should be respected because that is the outcome of an election, but in this case a referendum. But that doesn't mean that they get everything their own way. It doesn't work that way. It never has. As for the future of the Liberal Democrats, well, of course, Tim Farron's making a big thing of this. He's saying it's a blow to the Tory government and all that. Honestly, I don't think Theresa May is going to lose a lot of sleep over it. The Lib Dems are, I don't know if they'll ever be in the same position again as they were under Clegg and Kennedy. I do believe this country needs a solid centrist path, a solid centrist alliance, a solid centrist party. But that centrist party also needs to be realistic and understand why people are going to either the hard right or the hard left. And at the moment, I don't think Tim Farron is really paying attention. I mean, after the Cologne attacks, not long after that, he went to Germany to preach about tolerance. He didn't go to Germany to listen to the victims of sexual assault. And this is where the Lib Dems, I believe, are out of touch. They don't really grasp that there are concerns about assimilation, there are concerns about mass immigration, and there are concerns about Islamist terror. Now, like I said, I don't know Sarah Olney well enough to know what her response to these things would be. But if she is the sort of person who would turn around and say, oh, I'm not going to listen to you, you're a racist, then the Lib Dems are just going to end up in the wilderness. I do not expect them to just suddenly change their entire message and suddenly start talking like UKIP. That would be stupid. I'm sure even UKIP supporters would say that. So they shouldn't abandon their principles. But if their principles are about kind of putting blinkers on, like only paying attention with one eye, then they are going to be in a wilderness. Because if you don't pay attention to the concerns that people have, you know, it's all very well winning a by-election in an area that is going to be sympathetic to your values anyway. Quite another winning a by-election. If the Lib Dems win a by-election in a pro-Brexit area, then I would be impressed, and I would give them a lot of credit. You know, they're in a position now where they can afford to attack the government and the official opposition, because they're not big enough to really take any major responsibility. So they can afford to do this. But when Nick Clegg was in government, he knew difficult decisions were made. So it's very different from opposing and standing for something. Now, it's all very well coming out with wishy-washy language about tolerance and peace, and let's all get along with each other. But the Lib Dems are at real risk of looking like they don't really stand for anything. In other words, talking about these things just sounds utopian. You need to propose policies, hard policies. I'm not saying they haven't. I'm just saying that is the impression that they give. As a centrist, I want centrist parties to do well. The Lib Dems at the moment are a bit too left for my liking. I prefer them to be a bit more to the centre. I believe they're still better than Corbyn's Labour. They're not that far left, for sure. But I still believe they would come across, I'm not saying they are this way, but they would come across as arrogant liberal elite. Because their response, whenever issues of Islamist terror or problems of multiculturalism are raised, their problem is to close their ears. And that is not going to work. It just isn't. And yes, it is true that far-right or hard-right parties sometimes distort those situations. And interestingly enough, the areas where there is highest animosity to immigration is not always areas where there is the highest immigration rates. In fact, very often it's areas where there is per capita a lower rate of immigration. What Nick Clegg proposed, that there be a lower intake of immigrants to areas where there's social deprivation, I think that was common sense. I think that was a good proposition. Unfortunately, Nick Clegg is a bit like Tony Blair. His name is mud. I think somewhat unfairly. I think Nick Clegg is a very capable leader. I think he's far more heavyweight than Tim Farron. And the only reason I'm saying that about Tim Farron is from what I have seen so far. I don't think Tim Farron is actually hard left, but I do think he's like a lot of Liberal Democrats. He will not listen to concerns that people have. A lot of the left, for that matter. And they live in their own little liberal bubble where everything is nice and, oh, we're going to preach about multiculturalism and all the rest of it, not actually listen to the concerns people have. One reason I deeply resent the Lib Dems and one reason I left the party is because they will not vocally speak up against Islamic fascism, Islamic terror. Now, you would think a liberal party whose values are the polar opposite of Islamist values would be on the forefront of condemning this, but they're not. Tim Farron should be on the absolute forefront of condemning Islamist hate preachers, and he's not. That for me is a problem. So anyway, that's a few of my thoughts. I don't want to see any... I'm not going to censor this channel, but this video, but I don't want to see any really hardcore pro-Brexit views saying, oh, you were pro-Remain, blah, blah, blah. Respect works both ways, and if I respect the democratic mandate of that referendum, I would ask pro-Brexit people to respect the fact that not everyone who voted Remain is some sort of liberal elite with their, living in cloud cuckoo land, and it isn't a case of loving the EU. It's just a case that when I weighed everything up, I believed it was a better option. That's all. And I still have seen nothing to convince me that leaving the EU was the right course of action. Time will tell. Anyway, that's a few of my thoughts on that by-election.